Hi, I'm Dr. Neenu Garg. In this session, I will discuss various times that are associated with the process. So let's start. Before discussing various times associated with the process, I would like to discuss the concept of point in time and duration in time. Suppose there is a person P who goes to office daily at time 1 p.m. He enters the office at 1 p.m. and he leaves the office at 5 p.m. He stays in his office for a duration of about 5 minus 1 equals to 4 hours. Both the times 1 p.m. and 5 p.m. These are point in times. These are point in times. The duration during which he stayed in the office, which is 4 hours. This 4 hours duration is duration in time. So these concepts will help you to understand the various times that are associated with the process. Let's now discuss the various times of a process. The very first time is the arrival time. Arrival time is the time at which a process enters the ready queue. It is the arrival time. Completion time, the time at which process enters into the completion state, or we should say the time at which the process completes its execution. This time is termed as completion time. So the time when it will leave the CPU will be termed as completion time. Next is the waiting time. The total amount of time for which the process waits for the CPU to be assigned is known as waiting time. So basically, scheduling algorithms consider waiting time as the time a process spends in the ready queue. So sometime a process may spend waiting for some input output device, but such times are considered to be negligible in scheduling algorithms. So waiting time is the time which is spent by a process in the ready queue only. Next is the turnaround time. Turnaround time is the total amount of time spent by the process from its arrival to its completion. Means when it arrives in ready queue to its completion, means it leaves the system. That time is known as turnaround time. It is not necessary that during this time the process was in execution. It is possible that the process was waiting for CPU and at other time it was in execution with CPU. So turnaround time will be the sum of the waiting times and the time during which it was in execution with the CPU. Okay. CPU burst time. The total amount of time required by CPU to execute the whole process is called the burst time. It does not include the waiting time. So the time for which the process remains with CPU is termed as CPU burst time. Response time. Response time is basically the difference between the arrival time and the time at which the process first gets the CPU, that is its response time. For example, if you try to open some web page, right? The web page is not completely loaded on your screen. You might be able to see, say, some chat box, then the other contents of the web page are loading. In the meantime, the other content of the page is loading. So it is the time interval from where you typed the name of the web page in the browser to the time you saw the first response of the process. Input output time. The time a process spends for I/O is I/O time. It is important to note that all the scheduling algorithms consider the waiting time spent by a process for input output to be negligible. The waiting time is only the time which a process spends in the ready state. Rest all the time that it spends waiting for other devices are considered as negligible. Let's understand these times with the help of example. Initially, the process resides on hard disk. Long-term scheduler selects a process and load it into main memory for execution. Let the process is P1. And we assume that long-term scheduler loads this process P1 at time 1 unit, 1 millisecond, you say. Now, it is possible that CPU was not free at this time, so P1 has to wait. P1 is also in ready state and P1 is waiting for allocation to be to the CPU. Now CPU becomes free and short-term scheduler selects the process P1 and allocate it to CPU at 3 milliseconds. So approximately it waits in the ready state for 3 minus 1 millisecond, 2 millisecond. It waits for at least 2 milliseconds. It is given that burst time of P1 is 2 milliseconds. That is, it needs 2 milliseconds of CPU for its completion. So CPU gave it 2 milliseconds and after 2 milliseconds, P1 leaves. At 3 milliseconds, it arrives in CPU. 3 plus 2 becomes 5. So it completes its execution at 5 milliseconds. 1 millisecond is the arrival time. 5 millisecond is the completion time. And turnaround time, the time for which the process remains in the system from its arrival to its completion. That is 5, which is the completion time, minus its arrival time. It comes out to be 4 milliseconds. So turnaround time is the total time spent by a process once it arrives to the time it leaves the system. And in another terms, you can also say that this turnaround time covers the waiting time plus the CPU burst time. So there is another formula for calculating turnaround time, which is waiting time plus CPU burst time. Waiting time was 2 milliseconds and burst time was also 2 milliseconds, which is again 4 milliseconds. So there are two ways you can calculate turnaround time. Next is waiting time. So I have mentioned many times that waiting time is the time for which the process remains in main memory and it is in ready state to be allocated to CPU. Okay. So if we subtract the execution time from the turnaround time, then we will get the waiting time. See this formula. According to this formula, turnaround time is equal to waiting time plus burst time. If I have to find waiting time, then turnaround time subtract burst time. This will give me the waiting time of the process for which it is waiting for the CPU and it is in ready state. So these were the formulas. I hope that the various times associated with the process concept is clear.